Okay. So my presentation is on Aphra Behn's poetry. This is a paper that I wrote for Dr. Reed in her Women's Lit course last spring. And it specifically kind of talks about satire within her poetry and how she uses that to highlight gender and sexuality inequalities. So Aphra Behn was the first female writer to completely make her living from her writing. So this is like especially significant because not a lot of women wrote satire during that time as well. So it was the male-dominated genre of literature, let alone literature in general being male-dominated. She was born in 1640, died in 1689. So she wrote satire during the Restoration period. Awesome. Satire during this time, like I said, was male-dominated. A lot of women didn't write satire, but Aphra Behn used satire in order to make fun of or mock the gender roles that were existing at the time. Okay, so her poetry. So the poems that I'm going to be talking about are three specific poems: The Disappointment, On Her Loving Too Equally, and To the Fair Clorinda. So these poems address role reversal and the consequences of that, the loving of multiple people, and the loving without regards to gender. So her satirical approach discusses different relationships concerning masculine power and authority. It challenges the gendered language of her contemporaries as well as the very role of women within satire, which is normally excluded. Let's see. So the first poem that I addressed in my paper was The Disappointment. So this poem really showcases the reversal of gender roles during the time and kind of makes fun of those typical what women are supposed to do, what men are supposed to do, and specifically shows men with their loss of desire. Okay, so there's this line in the poem that states, men with their loss of desire and women with their lack of sexual satisfaction. It kind of she showcases exactly how men are supposed to be virile men, and they're supposed to be the ones who get the pleasure from sex, whereas in this specific poem, Behn talks about how the woman is supposed to get these sexual satisfaction in the relationship. Okay, moving on. Okay. So gender roles. The line, yet leave him the desire, in her poem, The Disappointment. As this poem progresses, this woman objects to the events unfolding, which eventually left her defenseless. And it is in this moment of vulnerability that the man prepares to possess the young maid, only to have his potency or ability to maintain an erection taken, yet leaving him that desire. So, in doing this, Behn has presented this experience of women being left unsatisfied because the man's pleasure takes priority. To complete this idea of role reversal, Behn actually shows the woman waking with a new desire for the man and the pleasure that he is supposed to give her. So this shows this male desire is okay, but female desire is full of disdain and shame. And then one of the papers that I read while doing some research was from this writer, Young, who approached this poem and said that it should be that the disappointment should be considered when reading. This poem begs to be approached from a satirical point of view, because the reversing of roles poses the question to men of how it would feel to be left without that sexual satisfaction. So it's this like turn of events in putting the woman in the male's position and the male in the woman's position. Her next poem that I addressed was On Her Loving Too Equally. So throughout literature, there's this like female dichotomy of there's two ways you can present women in literature up until a certain point in time. There was the Virgin Mary versus the virgin versus the whore, basically. So you have Virgin Mary versus Miss Claret's wife. You have Una versus Duessa and Spencer's the Fairy Queen. So you have these two representations of women in literature. And so Aphra Behn is just kind of subversing that and trying to present women in a different way. She examines the biased judgment of being a woman with multiple lovers. So in this poem, she kind of touches on polyamory and what it's like to be in a relationship with more than just one person. There is this controversial notion of loving more than one person that begs the question, is it even possible to love more than one person at a time? And this is evident when she states in her poem, passions flow, divided equally twixt the two. Further on in her poem, there is one line that says, "One golden pointed dart take back," in which she is trying to ask Cupid to take one of his arrows back, because these arrows represent true love. Therefore, the love that the speaker feels for both of these people are true love. And the two people that she loves in the story are Alexis and Damon, which Alexis is more of a feminine name, whereas Damon is more of a masculine name. So not only is she presenting a polyamorous relationship, she's representing a queer relationship as well. And this kind of seems to mock this idea of the time in which it's okay for a woman to love another woman, and even to possess sexual attention and passion, because she's seen as whole or unsullied if she loves a woman. Whereas if she were to love a man, then her virginity is taken, and she's kind of seen as this dirty or unholy female. All right, and then the final poem that I addressed in my paper was To the Fair Clorinda. This poem posits the refusal to conform to feminine or masculine traits. So this is kind of more of a dive into her queer poetry. There is a line from another essay that I wrote that says that the problems of assuming gender inclusiveness is relative to this poem specifically. While it may seem like this is Behn's intent, it could also be argued that Behn is trying to subvert gender stereotypes over time. So she calls attention not only to these gendered stereotypes, but also to the way we perceive and react to those stereotypes. So this poem is often seen as regarding a romantic friendship or sapphic love. This idea that this is simply a sapphic poem means that it does not call anything into question, nor does it comment on the social and political happenings around Behn. So kind of limiting it to those two kind of distinctions is kind of unfair to this poem, because it kind of covers a lot more than just sapphic love or romantic friendship. Behn presents this idea of a non-binary / gender queer lover while simultaneously blurring the standards to which women are held. So she's basically twisting society's logic surrounding women's virginity and kind of mocking that idea that a woman has to be a virgin or else she's of the devil. There is a line in her poem in which she calls her love interest a fair, lovely maid. The speaker, which is assumed to be Behn, calls Clorinda this fair, lovely maid because, but she instantly corrects herself as to not offend someone so noble with such a feminine title. And she ends up calling the lover a lovely, charming youth. So it's neither masculine nor feminine. She also says in her poem, "Against thy charms we struggle, but in vain. With thy deluding form thou givest us pain." So the speaker is basically pursuing Clorinda while questioning why, against thy charms, they struggle in vain, because Clorinda's misguiding form charms women like a man's, but they're not supposed to love her. So it's this whole idea of a female having the qualities of a man, but it's okay for her to chase her because they're not. Loving a woman isn't going to sully her or take away her virginity. Furthermore, on this poem specifically, this is one of the ones that I kind of really tried to focus in on. There's this line, "In pity to our sex thou wert sent, that we might love and yet be innocent." So using this term "our" when referring to gender implies that Behn is purposefully calling attention to how women are treated regarding sexuality. Furthermore, the speaker writes that they may be able to love her while remaining innocent because her form excuses it. So like I just said, she's able to pursue this love interest because she is a woman, or she has feminine features, so it would be okay for her to have sexual relations with her rather than a man. Okay. All right. So, satire and Behn's political content. So Behn was able to call these behaviors and morals into question in these throughout these particular poems, and she's able to adequately portray her thoughts regarding women's roles in society, specifically when it comes to the all too human traits of love and desire. And this causes Behn to challenge the gendered prose of her fellow scholars and the very role of women, like I've said. And in studying these poems from this perspective, we can determine that the argument concerning gender and sexuality has been a hot topic in literature for hundreds of years. Furthermore, Behn was ahead of her time, and so much like her other inventions and discoveries that threatened male supremacy, her writings were actually hidden and discredited because they encouraged women to question what was and still is considered the norm. And that is the end.
Questions for our speaker?
What led you to this research?
So in Women's Lit, we were actually reading specifically literature that was written by women. And so Dr. Reed kind of influenced us to write outside of that canon. And so we were looking at gender in the literary canon and sexuality within the literary canon. And so when we got to Behn, I'm also a theater major, so Behn also immediately caught my attention. But I never knew that she wrote poetry. And so when we were reading her poetry, I was like, oh, this is actually kind of advanced from the writings of her time. Mm-hmm. So like in the 1600s, sexuality, satire, literature was not a female-dominated field. Mm-hmm. And so I knew that I wanted to kind of address that and kind of go a little bit more deeper into what that actually meant for that society at the time.
Awesome.
Any more questions? Awesome. Thank you.
All right, let's thank our speaker again.